how you met Jerry Walsh.
Oh, I met Jerry Walsh through Rosemary Dibwad. When she retired from NERC in New York and United States and followed Gunnar to the service with the Save the Children in Geneva, they made a foundation in her memory, Rosemary Dibwad Award. And that's intended for people who wanted to go abroad to study the situation of the intellectually disabled, or as you said, mentally retarded. And he was the first recipient. So I got a letter that he would arrive to Stockholm and that he would be interested in stay there for 2 weeks and see a lot of things, and he should see me, and I was if I could do a program for him and work together with Carl Grunewald, and then he would come. And that's how we met. And when we really met as person, that was a very special experience. Because it was at Easter time, 1966. And there was a brand new institution south of Stockholm. And they know me. So I was allowed to bring Jerry there, even though it was Good Friday. And there's just a very few had moved in. It was a place for 450. And we have been fighting not to have that new institution. And Jerry and I walked around there, and it was very nice, with various buildings on the hills, and there was a little rivulet going through the village, and there was a piazza, and there was a barber shop, and there was another shop to be done, and they were all empty at the time. And then I showed him the house for the multi-disabled with all the new technicalities and single room and double rooms and so on. And then he was gone. And I thought, yeah, I see, okay, I go. So I went out to the men's room, but there he was washing his face. And then he burst out, here you are saying what's wrong with this and that and this and that, and that this should never have been done. And I assure you, I will never in my life see anything as good in the United States. And he was crying, this strong man. He was so upset. That's how we met. And then we started to talk. And that went on. And he started to tell about American institutions and so on. Then we found out we spoke the same language. And then he invited me he stayed with me for a week, and then he stayed with Carl Grunewald for a week. And so on. He had been to Denmark too, and went to Norway. And then I got the invitation to go to Minnesota. Yeah, then I came to Minnesota, and it was in the beginning of 1967, January and February, because, at that time, they are making all the bills and books and so on, and it's not a very good time to go out lecturing or talking. So the Swedish Parent Association let me go for 3 weeks. That ultimately became 6. But that's a different story. But I worked with Jerry, and the way that I had brought with me pictures of Swedish institutions, because Jerry had told me otherwise they won't believe you. And the first show, the first presentation I was going to do, after that one, it was in Rochester. After that one, he showed me some of the slides and pictures and a film of what I was going to see in the Minnesota institutions. And that shocked me, as well as it. And what happened was that when I showed my slides over the Swedish new institutions and showed what a normal rhythm of the day you could have there, also if you were severely retarded, and normal rhythm of the week and how they could do, because the environment supported you, you know what to do. And sure. Then after a while, in the end, I saw parents crying. And because that's not how they thought about institutions, what they expected from institutions. And later on I realized it, because when I came to ferry boat, the first one, if I hadn't been warned through Jerry and his pictures, it would have been tougher. But now I knew what to expect. And I was terribly shocked over what I saw. Especially the Dakota building, with 104 into one bedroom, mostly half naked or even naked, men, with 3 staff. An awful smell, because the machine to get the smell out wasn't enough. And they had they had a sitting room, a sitting room without benches in the next room, so to say. With only a few benches, but not for everybody. And toilets opening directly into them, where I saw naked men lying on the floor, squeezing their fists. And that was awful. And the other thing, I came to see children's homes, children's places where they were bed to bed, with cribs, where they were stuck and had all the feeding equipment tied into their faces. And there they were lying to be fed that way, never learned to swallow. And there I was taking a photo, and the doctors tried to stop me from shooting. And I said, my camera is my eye. And this is a public place. And the child doesn't object, because it giggles at me. It tries to express itself in eye contact with the child. And then I saw the girls we had, and they had to show, we showed your best. The best girls, they were dormitories for 40 girls. 40 girls coming from school in the air, on the institutional grounds. And then they come home to do their homework in the bedroom for 40 children. And I couldn't believe my eyes. The worst I had seen so far, I had seen in Denmark, where I had seen 24 in the same room. And in Sweden, where I once had seen 12 in one bedroom, and quite a few times 10. And a day room I've seen with 15 once, in very bad conditions, but nothing like that.
So you saw these horrendous conditions.
Yeah, I saw those horrendous conditions, and I commented upon them. And I reacted and commented upon them in my presentations. And then Jerry saw to it that when I came out of the institutions, there were journalists or there were TV there and so on. Because I helped the ARC in a campaign against the institutional conditions and for improvement of programs and making programs in the community to prevent people from going into institutions. I commented upon these conditions at several occasions, both when I sometimes came out of them or I was asked by a reporter or a radio commentator or even by TV. I commented on them, and also in my lectures. And also when it was in the end of my visit, I was invited to speak to Governor Levander and to speak for a committee at the House of Representatives, financial committee, what is called, of the Senate and House of Representatives, dealing with money. What's it called? Finance. And I talked about these conditions, and my thesis I started to learn a thing there that I later expressed it. I couldn't do at the time, but I've done it far later and said, you don't invest in meaningless buildings. That's throwing money away, because they only cost you more and more, and they're impossible to work in. And the more people and staff you put in, they still don't work. You invest in people, because they improve their knowledge by the years. Not like buildings that decay, but they improve, and they all the time out in the community, and they become more and more valuable and useful. And that's why you do. If you want a cost benefit, you invest in people. That's what I've been preaching, so to say, in Canada and in Germany and so on. later on in the years, but not in the beginning. I had the hard way to go first.
Okay.
Yeah, and I had started to understand that I had to find a concept to join the various impressions I had about the situation of intellectually disabled children and adults in different positions, some kind of insight into their lives that kind of hang together. And I expressed some of that in Minnesota at that time. And that what started me really going. I had done it a little in Sweden, but here I had to really do it over and over and improve it all the time. And I used to say that you should have a normal rhythm of the day, and that you should have in the family. And that's difficult to have when you're a multi-disabled child at home. Or when you have normal rhythm of the week, which is also difficult, where you should go to school. But if there is no school, and when you go to work, but if there is no work for your son and daughter, that's not our normal rhythm of the day. And where is the normal leisure time for the child or for the young adult? That's no normal rhythm of the week. And when I looked into the institution, I found there was no normal rhythm of the day. Everyone renting up in the same time, being washed at the same time, eating quickly, and then sent out to something, or going back to do nothing. And then having lunch, rushing in, and grabbing each other's food and so on, and then back doing nothing, and then being washed and put into pajamas or whatever, and put to bed at 5:30. So that you were ready and prepared for bed when the night staff arrived. There was no normal rhythm of day. There was no normal rhythm of week in the institution. They were abnormal. And I wanted as normal life conditions as possible. And I found I had to bring it down to a normal rhythm of the day, a normal rhythm of the week, the normal rhythm of the changing of the seasons, that you dress differently, eat differently, do different things, Christmas and Easter and vacation time and sports and food and 50 years birthday, family birthday, your own birthday. And then the normal rhythm of the life cycle. That you are a baby and born and need all the support and service and stimulation as much as possible, not to be taken away from the mother. Instead of, you should support the family, that the family, even though the child is intellectually disabled, should have as a normal time with the child, as a small child as possible. And the child should get stimulation, and the normal go to school and be a child. And then the normal fact of life is that an adolescent, you grow up and become an adult. And that is an important thing. And you also have to prepare yourself for an adult life, because people at that time were looked upon as children. And they didn't have a time to be adult because they were looked upon as children. Both in the society, with very little jobs to go to, and that's why we in Sweden, for example, was very active those years to get sheltered workshops. Because otherwise there was nothing to go to but go to institutions. And people didn't want their children to go to institutions after they had gone out of schools and lived in the community and lived in the family homes. On the other, they couldn't go on living in the family home forever. So they needed some place, normal place to live as an adult, to have an apartment or live in a group home. And that you couldn't have that normal rhythm of life in an institution, because it meant you started out in the child's section, and then you moved over to the adolescent section, and then you moved over to the adult section. That's not the normal life cycle with the growing and learning and becoming mature to make this. Because in an institution, you don't learn anything. You learn things outside in life, outside of school even, by experiences and by observations and so on. And you learn to act and to handle those situations. In institutions, you cannot, what they tell you, what you have been learned, you can't adapt that to that sterile vacuum environment. You don't learn anything from it except to obey. And you are diminished by it. And you are disabled by it. And that's what's wrong with institutions. when I said these things and developed upon this theme of normal, which I hadn't finished by that time, I was still working at it, or trying to formulate it and so on, and giving more and more speeches. And Jerry Walsh really run me as if I were running for office. Okay. And then he set me up in Nebraska in a regional conference for the ARC. And there I had to present it at a buffet, a big buffet with 500 people. And I couldn't eat anything, and people were sitting there with their hungry eyes. It was a very awkward experience. But by that time, I got my first slides that I'd taken in Faribault and some other places ready, and I put them in my Swedish slides to show the contrast. And wow, that worked. And that was a kind of a shocker, and it worked out very well. And then I got something, suddenly I saw everybody stood up. And I got what the school I learned was a standing ovation. So that was well received. Wolfensberger was there, and he thought this was quite good, but nothing remarkable. But he thought it was quite good. Later on, when he read me, he thought it was somewhat interesting. Then the third time, Gunnar Dybwad told him to go to Denmark and Sweden and see for himself. But that thing started there, because there were people from several states. And it was Minnesota who brought this. And then the rumor started to spread. And then I was asked to go to Wisconsin and phone home and get permit to stay longer. Then they wanted me in Washington. And I told them. And in Pennsylvania. And then up in Massachusetts. Dybwad's arrangement, because Teddy Kennedy had heard me. I was speaking in because Jerry put me in touch with the Humphreys in St. Paul at a Barnum and Bailey's, the big circus. They had a show there where Hubert Humphrey, as vice president, was present. And then I was introduced to him, and we sat down and spoke when all the elephants and all the funny things were going on. And he said, "You must see my wife." And so I was invited to his home in Washington, D.C., where I showed my slides and had a long talk with Mrs. Muriel Humphrey, who was very, very knowledgeable. And then they told Ted Kennedy about this, and he suddenly ordered a dinner, a banquet to be given at Harvard Club in Massachusetts, and I had to see Governor Volpe and present my slides presentation there. And I had again to phone home and said I had to stay on. And suddenly this idea about normalization became known. But it was thanks to Minnesota that brought it in and get it known, because Jerry heard it and he let the other states surrounding hear it, and then the rumor spread, and I guess he was on the phone. He was on the phone. I think it was good. And then after a year, they came, later on that autumn, came an invitation from the President's Committee to write down my impressions of the American institutions. Because they said that they had heard that I was direct descriptions and no bones about it, and was very clear. And that they were writing a book that helped to deal with changing the residential situations in the United States. So I was asked to write about my impressions of American institutions. That book was called Changing Patterns of Residential Services for Mentally Retarded. But you see, when I was asked, I didn't have time to do it. And my parents, the association, I had so much work, so they wouldn't let me go. Then Jerry again came to the rescue, because he got finance. So they took me over to New York, where he was working then, with the American ARC, and as vice director, and he executive director, and he arranged for me to see some more institutions, get used to the language, and then he worked with the parents committee that brought me down to Washington, and there I was writing. But then I told them I can't write what was wrong with American institutions unless I explain my perspective. And my perspective I did and I call it the normalization principle. And they locked me in for 3 days and nights. I was in the Ministry of Health, Education and Welfare, and that night at the Willard Hotel. And then I dictated to 3 different secretaries and got it done after notes and so on. And that was Jerry, and that was Minnesota that made this possible, both to get respect for the criticism of the institutions and for expressing the principle of normalization. And then when the book came, in the final chapter was written Gunnar Dybwad, and he said that the normalization principle, as in my presentation, was the most important part of the book. And in later descriptions, I read that they found when they got the principle, they got something to hang it up on. That was positive. And that was negative. So that's what's important. But it started in Minneapolis. So there was quite some positive reaction because it was also new. But because it was new, there was resistance to it from, let's say, older generations or other tight occupations. Mainly the doctors. Of course, the people in charge of institutions. And they were the ones who were conservative, the ones that believed in the institutions and that had to defend them and to say that is the very best solution we can have. And they should be grateful for it and not complaining about it. That's why I had, and these others, they say, that's fancy ideas. And they misunderstood it. Some people thought that the normalization principle meant making people normal. I've never met a normal person in my life. Are you normal? I picked them out and said that's normal. But as soon as I said what said is normal, people start on working on them and said, explaining to him that he's not normal. He's different from them. Any person, each person is different. No, it has to do with normal conditions of life that you have to offer. And in the daily life and in the weekly life, and what are the patterns of life in the community that you have to learn about and adjust to. And you have your personal rhythm, and you have the rhythm of the day that changes from the morning till the evening. And you have the various things you do in the daytime. You go to school or you go to work. And then you do different things at different days of the week. And then you have the weekends. And you say, etc. So that kind of normal.
Okay. Describe for me briefly the conditions of your institutions here in Sweden and Denmark that your point of reference.
Yeah.
What were our, at the time that you went to Minnesota in the mid-60s, go ahead.
Yeah, at the time of of that, I had experience since 1961 working with the Swedish Parent Association. And I went around also visiting in Swedish institutions. And I saw some very bad conditions there. I was shocked when I saw as many as 10, 12 children to a room or a dormitory. And I saw some half-naked children at some special hospital for profoundly emotionally disturbed children and so on. But they were rather acceptable. By that time we have started to build new institutions and make them more modern in the 50s and in the 60s, and make them more like villages with single rooms and double rooms and so on. And then I was started to go to Denmark to see their things because I was asked for a discussion in Oslo 1963 to give the Parent Association approach to attitude to institutions. And I saw a series of Danish institutions, and they were far worse than Sweden. Sweden was a long-stretched country where the counties had to deal with it. So they did one little home, not for a couple of hundred or so on. But in Denmark there were state institutions for thousands. And larger institutions, you see, and with larger buildings and larger dormitories. So as a children's, for 40 children or 50. And also for adults with 18 to each room and 36 to each room and that kind of thing. And I talked about how that kind of thing were. And we were discussing this, and we were discussing how to improve the conditions in the institutions. And then I said, it's normal to have a room of your own. We were arguing for single rooms. And we were arguing, it's normal, you don't have to build a boarding school for children. You rent a villa and have a group home for children that go to school in the community. And that way we cut down the boarding schools that each county or every second county had, or they got together on having a boarding school for all children in that area. But I mean, then we're within the old military caserne, barracks and things like that, and old special buildings, and only meeting themselves. And I know how unhappy the kids were when I went there. They always talked about how unhappy they were because they knew what their siblings could do that they couldn't do. And they said, well, I'm going to such a school like this. What will I ever do when I come out? And so on. So there. And of course, the Swedish authorities start to understand that boarding schools are not the proper pedagogical environment for children. They don't learn there. They have to be confronted with real life so they can use their knowledge and learn from experience, and that the teacher have some simulations outside to work with, because there they got motivation from the children. They want to know more about sports. They learn much better to read sports magazines and sports news in the newspaper than boring books. They know more about reading about pop records. They learn better reading there than reading from. They have to be motivated. And that started to be understood. And also that's how we got introduced English in the special schools. And had learning English is mandatory in the regular special schools classes in Sweden. And because it was very popular. And that's kind of thing, background, that made the contrast of the American institutions so strong, because we had separated in Sweden the small homes for children from the larger institutions for adults. And here in America you had everything, all levels, all complications, all children and adults. And that was not very healthy. I call it a normalization principle, because it says that, that if you allow intellectually disabled or other disabled to experience the regular circumstances of life and patterns of life in your community and the normal regular conditions of life in your society, or as close to them as possible, then as normal as possible, then you come as normal as possible, conditions of life as possible. And that's what it means. It doesn't mean making people normal, but it means making their life conditions normal in the daily life and in the community and in all kind of aspects. And I define them by 8 facets. The normal rhythm of the day, get out of bed, that you don't go to bed too early, that you eat with different rhythm of the day, there's a life change between sleep and sleep. And that is important for parents to have that normal rhythm of the day when they have a disabled child at home and need support in their home sometimes when they're multi-disabled and severely retarded. And that kind of thing, that you have transportation services if you are physically disabled and intellectually disabled. Or the contrast is that in the institution you don't have any normal rhythm of the day. And the same goes with normal rhythm of the week. That you have something that is private, where you live, where you have your own things that you like, where you have the things you have collected and that you are fond of, and where you can be yourself and be dressed as you want to, and so on. And meet the people that you like. And that you then go to school or go to work, and that you have leisure time. And you have special days, you do this, and Wednesdays you do this, and sports some evening, and friends some other evening, and sometimes you just sit for yourself and watch TV. And then you have the weekends where you meet people or your family, and so on. That's the normal rhythm of the week. And that you have to have even if. And I used to compare, how is that for a regular family, and how does the normal rhythm of the week look for a family with a disabled child, or with a disabled adult living at home. And there you have it, etc., etc. and the normal rhythm normal rhythm of the year and of the seasons and of the life cycle and becoming adult and having your respect for your wishes, that you have the right to self-determination, the normal respect, and that you can help to decide for yourself, that you have the patterns of how you boys meet girls and so on, in the sexual morals of your culture, and the economic conditions of your country, the same rights as other citizens, economical rights, and then you have the same environmental demands as to standards of living, and institutions don't fall into that category. And that is what I call the principle of normalization, the 8 facets, to make it short, to establish normal conditions as possible. It's a principle because if you do it, you are more likely to act right than wrong. That's why it is a principle.
Distinguish that briefly from that of Niels Erik.
Yeah, Niels Erik Mikkelsen and I wrote to talk because I found the first expression in the preamble to the Danish law, when said that the aim of the law was to establish as normal conditions of life as possible for the intellectually disabled. And I quoted that a couple of months later in Oslo. And then I have used it always as a quote to build up my principle. And I said it. And he liked that very much because I made it famous. that kind of expression. He later said he didn't know whether he had written it or the secretary had written it. I just happened to dig it out from the preamble. But he liked it certainly. But he meant, as I said to me, normal things is that people should live where other people live, as other people live. People should go to school and work as other people do. And they should have leisure time the way other people have. And they should have the same legal rights as any other. That's what's normal. And that's what I want to apply. And that's all he needs to say. The rest is philosophy. He said he meant Wolfensberger, but I know he said that I was doing too much philosophy about it. But he was a practical man. Tremendous impact. He was the leader of the Danish organization operating the institutions. And he was their first critic. He had enormous guts. And of course he had lots of fights to take up because he criticized his own institutions. And in the end, he didn't have an easy time because he couldn't quite realize what he wanted. Whereas in Sweden it went a different way. Because in Sweden there was a countess who did, and there was a general inspectors for the care and for the school that came out and controlled the standards and got it lifted. And we got changes in the legislation that improved the conditions. And my perspective was different because I didn't see it as an operational kind of thing. I tried to understand what the intellectually disabled themselves felt. Because I had talked to them so much in institutions. And how sad they were that they were there. How boring it was. How they missed their relatives. How they know what problems they were for their parents. And how sad they were for the sorrows of their parents that they had caused. And that they didn't feel that they would ever come out. And what could they do out there? They felt a pessimism and no hope for the future. And nobody listened to them. And I talked to children who lived with their parents and young adults that we had in our clubs. And they said the same thing. We are going to such and such a school. What kind of chances do we have? And I can't do this, but my father or mother don't believe that I am able to do this and that and so on. And I found that they didn't come there. That they were not assisted in becoming adults. And I learned from their perspective. Because I wanted to see how do they feel a normal day should be when they see people around them. How do they realize how do they want their day to be normal from their conditions? As normal as possible in their eyes. And how do they have a normal day when they compare themselves with how others are living, etc. I had it hidden, that perspective. The principle of education is an instrument for empathy, to start to learn from the inside on the conditions of life of the intellectually disabled and what has to be done and changed in his or her interests, from his or her perspective. And what are the different pedagogical steps and changes in the social circumstances that has to be taken so he can develop and grow and come as normal to apply himself to the normal conditions he wants. That is that. And have the right to self-determination, the right to say so. So he realized that he's been seen, that he's recognized, that he's respected. That was all about. And that's the important part, because there is a third person who has written about normalization, and that's Wolfensberger, who liked my idea. He had heard me speak and said it was good, rather good, and he read my paper and he said, yeah, it's quite good and interesting. And then Gunnar Dybwad told him, you should go and see for yourself. This is just not imaginations. They do things like that in Scandinavia. And he went over and we met and so on. And then he happened to come to Toronto at the same time as I did. And then he wrote a book. So my perspective is the perspective of the people with intellectual disability, or any ability, by the way, because as it applies to multiple disabled, it of course applies also to people who are just blind, or just amputees, or just paraplegic, or cerebral palsy, or deaf, by mutatis mutandis, and so on. But then Wolfensberger wrote a book, and we came to Toronto at the same time, and I placed my the things that I had developed in my touring in Canada or in the United States in the second tour that Jerry Walsh wouldn't go, I put down as a right to self-determination. But he published a book called Normalization, and I didn't think very much of it first because I didn't have time to read it very carefully. But then little and little I started to understand that he had taken my concept and twisted it. Because he meant something like you should use regular means to obtain normal cultural means to obtain normal conditional aims or whatever in the community. And he did what I thought really complicated things. No need to translate my simple American language to complicated American language. And he also found that he got it backwards, because he felt that the person should conform, so that people could see they should be trained and educated and learn to approach, so they behaved as anybody else, so they wouldn't be mistaken for intellectually disabled, so that they could pass. He called his system pass, just as sometimes the blacks in the old times, they talked about the pass, to pass over into the world of the white, if they change. And that's never the idea. He was very concerned with how people looked at mental handicap. He did a very good thing in what are the conditions that you should ask or in group homes or in occupations and so on, in various details to make things as normal, so that it looks as normal as possible and so on. It's very good at that. But the idea was not to make people normal. The idea was to learn them to accept themselves, have them respected for whom they were. I didn't care for what people thought about people. Wolfensberger was concerned with the image that they presented and how people saw them, and that they should be accepted as regular persons and not with a disability. My concern was I didn't care what other people thought about them, because it really didn't mean anything until it came to action. But what was important was how people with intellectual disability thought about others, thought about the people they met, and what they wanted for themselves, and their right to be themselves. And that's a great difference. And later we had some conflicts because of that. Yeah, what happened ultimately was that in Sweden, when this book had been published in the United States, and my paper had been translated to Swedish, and I had the first conferences for intellectually disabled, then there became a conflict. Because, for the first, I had started working with young people, and I had a course in social training the summer 1965 for 2 weeks. When they were out shopping, I'd asked the parents about their skills and what they liked and what they didn't like and so on. And then we were together, and they had two of them, one boy and one girl, went to the nearest town and did things, shopped and so on, with one assistant with them. And then we report about the observations, and then we went on and did more and more advanced things. And then we evaluated them. We did a lot of entertaining things because it was a summer course for 2 weeks. And I learned through that how lonely they were, that I could teach them a few things, but they knew more. But the parents didn't know that they knew it. The parents' information to me was very often wrong. The kids had more skills than the parents knew, because the parents never could see them out in the community on their own. They were always with the parents. So it was easy that they could. And then I had to talk with parents. It was sometimes difficult to translate. And the kids say, I know I can. Mom knows. Mother knows that I can, but my father won't allow me. Or the vice versa. My father wants me to, but my mother says no. And that made a very difficult situation for them. Just exactly in growing up and making decisions. So in my clubs we have the rule, here we are all adults. Half of the people were intellectually disabled and half are just regular young people who come in to work with them. And then we had courses in this. The people who took part in this first summer course, they formed a club in Stockholm. And they had friends and they served another club. Then I started having courses in how to form clubs and to train them how to do. And that's how I invented the attitude changing machine. And that's the one that I also talked about when I was taken over later on to the States. The attitude changing machine was what I call the pedagogical construction of these workshops I had to train or educate the people who are supposed to be as leaders of the groups for young adult intellectually disabled, the non-disabled. And I called it a weekend course in being a tourist. So they came to a hotel in a new town, and then they come together, 4 or 6 from the same city, half men, half women, and half intellectually disabled, half not. No? And they came there, and then I said, okay, I forgot to do anything. I had no time. So you have to manage on your own. We'll have a course in being a tourist, but I have no meals arranged, and so on. So you have to manage on your own. So each one of you will have an equal amount of money that I handed out in envelopes. And we will have three sessions. And the first session is that you tomorrow find out where to go in town, how the time is, and what to do in town. And tomorrow evening, you do what you like to do. And suddenly you do a walk and look over the city and get acquainted with people. And you are all divided into groups. And then I said, no, we have to be with them. We promised the parents. I said, no, this is a workshop. You are not, when you are a tourist, you meet new people. And you are here to meet new people. You're not here to meet the same people you know already. That's no sense. So you meet 2 different peoples in each one of these 3 occasions. And then they had the first meeting in the morning. The first was to go out and do some shopping and out in the traffic and find out what place to have lunch and find out what restaurants there were to eat in the evenings and what things were amusing things going on or what kind of tourist things there were in the city and so on. And then they came back after lunch, and then I had the intellectually disabled got a lecture from the tourist man from the tourist office and a man from the hotel who told them about that you could order breakfast in the room in the morning and so on, and what services you had at the hotel and so on. And then the others were reporting to me about their observations. And then the people from their hometown would say, no, he can't do that. Yes, he can. And then they knew who they will meet next, so they took notes about the people they were going to have meet for the next session. And that way they started to listen to what the reports they had about them, because of the people they had and because they were going to meet some others. And there was always the same kind of reactions, that, oh no, really? And so on. And then they had the evening, and then we were told it was the intellectually disabled who should decide what they wanted to do. And I was told, do something you had never done before, something you always wanted to do. I mean, I think it was real fun. And if you don't have enough money, come and apply, see if you have a good idea, I might give something out. And they did lots of very funny things. Some even went to church sometime because they wanted to see how another religion was happening there. And somebody went to a concert, and some other went over to Denmark at one time, and so on. In Canada used it, and they went to a trotting place in the evening and was allowed to sit in a sulky and learn and be in the stables and so on. The most funny event I had ever was when a group from an institution with moderately severely disabled met outside two cars, met with two staff and two disabled in each car who was not serving each other at the same time, and decided they want to go a washing machine through the car wash, but sit in the chair, sit in the car. And that was a great idea, but to save money, we can get in your car. And then suddenly there were 8 people, 4 staffers from one ward, and 4 people from other wards, intellectually disabled, severely retarded, moderately retarded, and not mildly, who went through that together. And that gave me the idea to call it my attitude changing machine, because when they get through this washing machine out, they were quite different in their association. And that the same what happened in the courses. Because afterwards, when they came home in the evening, some went on when they was dancing, they started dancing there and so on. But in the next morning, I took in the report what happened during the night. And the young kids, the young adults, they ordered coffee to their rooms and eggs to their room and whatever. And some even took a quick walk on his own and so on, differently. Because we said the next one starts at 10:30, and that was the time you took a walk. Because then you know what things to see, and you had lunch. Then you met the third group, but you had learned, you had the same experience of the workshop. And that's how it came. And then when that was over, they came back and reported to me, the non-disabled, so-called non-disabled. And then I had the disabled met in a special room and discussed, what did you think about this workshop? What was good about it? What was bad about it? How was the people? How was the experience? And what do you recommend for the next time, and so on? And then when the people had discussed, I brought in the report and the intellectually disabled, and they reported back to them directly how they had experienced this thing. And then it dawned upon the non-disabled that they were the pupils and the teachers were the disabled, the intellectually disabled, because they could tell them, they had learned to understand how they saw life, what they wanted and what they enjoyed and what they were fearing and what they wanted to learn more about. And that's important. And I built these 3 steps on my definition of how I interpreted disability. And the first one is the cognitive deficiency, the cognitive impairment or lowering of capacity. And that's a hard one to deal with, because you can't compensate from it. And that shows how much. The second handicap is the lack of knowledge, lack of experience. How to be in a restaurant if you've never been to a restaurant, etc. We all have to learn that. And lack of knowledge, lack of experiences. And that's the second step. That's why they had to go on to do things they'd never done before and so on. The first was to observe what they actually knew, if they could handle traffic, if they could shop, and so on, and check with what the parents and the information had. And the third one dealt with the third disability, the handicap awareness. The self-awareness that I'm stupid, that I'm not as bright as others. I've gone to such and such a school. I'm not allowed to, or don't know if I'm able to, and so on. And then, if they opened up and told about themselves and got the self-respect back, and then I knew they had been handling it right. And that's what I taught them. And then they went ahead and had clubs formed, and on the conditions of the people, of the disabled themselves, of the intellectual disabled themselves. And later on, when they had up to 40 clubs, in the meanwhile, we started weekend courses in democratic procedures. How to form a club, how to elect a board, how to be a chairman, secretary, board member, treasurer, how to handle a committee, how to work in a committee, and so on. And did it step by step. They came in a Friday lunch, and then in the Saturday evening at 2 o'clock, we left them, and said, okay, you have a couple of amount of money that you can apply for, but the evening you have to decide what to do, and you have to do it yourself. And then they come in after 2 hours work, they organize themselves, come in, asked for demands, got the money, and then they had a big party in the evenings, and that was the most funny part. And afterwards they realized they'd done it all by themselves, with no help whatsoever. And that was great. One of the real problems with growing adults that we all have is to get a fair judgment of yourself, which is constantly have to change through those years before you really get stabilized. You have to do a lot of decisions, and you have to make mistakes, but you have to make them on your own. And if you are stopped from making that kind of decisions, then you are stopped in the growth. Being adult means making decisions, acquiring competence to be, and to uphold it in your own faith, to believe in yourself. What's happened to so many intellectually disabled is that they've been told, you can't do this, you can't do that. They are brought up with a kind of inferiority feeling, in the old-time expression of that. Self-doubt. And mistrust, then insecure of what are my capacities. And they make misjudgments sometimes. That's a way to learn too. We all do that. But you have to believe in yourself. They have been manipulated far too much. And people have, with the goodness of their heart and the wise wisdom of their heads, boom, boom, they have been telling what to do, instead of listening to them and let them do things and learn, as adults do, from experience and from watching others, other people than their parents. And that's what the strengths of the clubs were. And then they could deal with the same problems and discuss it with them and talk to each other about it. And that helped them to be self-independent. Whereas we have in Scandinavia a horrible thing that is called the law of Jante. The law of Jante is the 10 commandments. The first one says, you shall not believe that you are anything. Second, you shall not believe that you are as good as we are. The third, you shall not believe that you are wiser than we are. Fourth, you shall not fancy yourself that you are better than us. 5, you shall not believe that you know more than we do. 6, you shall not believe that you are more worth than we are. 7, you shall not believe that you are good for anything. 8, you shall not laugh at us. 9, you should not believe that anybody cares about you. 10, you shall not believe that you can teach us anything. The law of Jante is the law of evil. is a parody of the 10 Commandments. It's the commandments of evil, of envy, of putting down, of mobbing. It's a term of the conditions in the small communities and small villages when everybody knows about each other and you can accept that someone gets very good at something, but he has to be very good to be accepted. Otherwise, don't think you are anybody. And that's unfortunately a Scandinavian kind of a concept. But I think it's rather unique, but universal. But it is somewhat difficult. But if you think about it, when you work with rehabilitation, when you have lost your legs in attack, become paraplegic, and lost all self-confidence, and when you have got blind, or when you have got a leg amputated, or when you want to grow up as with cerebral palsy, or with intellectual disability. Rehabilitation is about assisting person to be able to believe in their capacity, and to have judgment about the capacity. Judgment, you see, you have, because you have the knowledge and you have the experience. Without having the opportunity to get knowledge about it, without having had the opportunity to have opportunities, you don't have the chance to have a judgment. And too often we have taken away from intellectually disabled the ability to get knowledge, the possibility to get knowledge, and the possibilities to have experiences. And they have such a bad judgment. Of course. And that's not true, because they have judgment, more judgment than you believe, than you would know about. But now I lost the thread here.
These are some of the things I said.
Yeah.
Go ahead. And
then we had, with these things, I also succeeded in getting the first meeting of intellectually disabled, chosen by their own, for a meeting with 20 persons from different parts of the country in 1968. And now we know his story. It was the first conference ever of intellectually disabled, where they were the main interest, where they organized their discussions, and then presented it to the meeting, the biannual meeting of the Parents Association. In 1970, we had that done with 50 participants from 24 of the Swedish counties, 1 man and 1 woman from each one, plus 2 from Denmark. And they worked in 3 days and presented a platform on their views on their situation, on their views on living conditions, or they wanted apartments of their own or group homes, wanted to move away from home, and so on, wanted to move out of institutions, about the demand for more education, better vocational schools, and their demand for workshops and better work and working conditions, and they wanted to have a labor union organization in the unions, and they wanted better pay. And then the relation on social social rights. And then they elected their own board and demanded of the Parent Association to pay for the cost for the meetings for this board. And that they presented to the meeting of the Parent Association, the biannual one, 1970. The first time, 68, there had been a very positive reaction. People were completely surprised. Now they know, now these things had been a little discussed. And then some parents sat there and had tears of happiness, because they realized that this was good. They had children, they know about those, had taken part in the courses. Other parents had very rigid faces and were very upset, and some were, because that was going too far. As a consequence after that, I was informed, not formally, but indirectly, very clearly, that from now on, the principle of normalization that has just been translated, had been accepted everywhere, was my personal idea, and not the policy of the Parent Association. And most of them hadn't really understood it, because I had not been allowed to speak about it. In certain terms, I speak to others, but not so much in the Parent Association about it. And then they said this youth organization had to be controlled by parents and not by the people. I got respected, accepted as a youth organization, as an adult education organization, and got government money for both of it. Now the parents wanted to run the show. And I said, I won't accept that. Just the way I would be forced to work contrary to what I think, and that I could hurt people, and I could hurt myself. So I said, goodbye. And that's when Jerry Walsh came into the picture. Because he got a report of that from Bengt Nirje, but I was out, and then I got the invitation to come over to Minnesota again, and to Wisconsin. And this time I was out for 4 months. And during that time, I had been writing that summer after I left. I had been writing for the British Journal Mental Subnormality about widening the normalization principle to explain how it worked for multi-disabled and so on, and also a little about the law of self-determination and the handicap definition. And then I went on, invited by Jerry to come over to Minnesota and to Wisconsin first. I was 3 weeks in Wisconsin, and one they paid me by offering him a free week in Minnesota with Jerry and lecturing in Minnesota, then Wisconsin, and then came Indiana, and then came San Francisco, and then came Seattle and Vancouver, and then Nebraska, and then Wisconsin again, and then Pennsylvania, and then Massachusetts with Dibba, and Toronto. And there I was offered a job. And then I accepted and took the job in Toronto. But it was Jerry who took me over for this speaking tour. And during that tour, I could deepen my presentation of the normalization principle, and I could develop the idea about the right to self-determination. And I had this, I demonstrated this attitude change machine in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, in a weekend course. And one of the guys there was a short order cook. His last name was Tracy. And he liked that training that he got so much. So then later on he expressed this so well, so he got hired by Texas. So he was the first intellectually disabled hired by any ARC, and that was in Texas, to promote the right to self-determination and club work for disabled. His uncle that had supported him was a man called Tracy, but his first name was Spencer. That Spencer Tracy was his uncle. He was a very good guy. Both of them were. When I came back in Sweden, I left Sweden in protest.
Right.
Then I took a job here, which was a mistake. I shouldn't have come down to the local when I was used to work on the national. Ah. And especially as I got it on my merits, and the leading politics didn't want me. So they stopped me. They say, now this is coming and trying to increase. So I was director of the services, but they never accepted anything. They didn't let me. They put a person on top of me who just disliked everything I stood for. And after 3 years, I had a heart attack, and that's out. Oh. And I said I never wanted to have anything to do with them. Okay. That was a hell of a frustration. And I did some things, yes, but not at all to the extent that I wanted to, that I could have done. Now it's changed. But then I had 1.5 years sick with heart bypass and complications. Mm-hmm. So it took me 1.5 years to work on my own rehabilitation. And then I kept up the sport work and so on. But then I joined the Center for Disability Research, as it's now called. I started to work with the group dealing with ALA. What you are looking over in the ceilings there, in the yellow buildings, mm-hmm. That's why I was hired by the Parents Association. One of the reasons was to strengthen the Parents Association, because the second was to widen our international experience, because I had the languages. I came from the Swedish Institute and I had German, French, and English, and to get ideas from abroad, and then to help start a foundation called ALA, Adaptation to Life and Work, here in Uppsala, with a research council, with a sheltered workshop, and boarding homes, and boarding homes for 2 for 21 in three levels of apartments with 7 single rooms and double rooms in a couple of apartment houses some blocks away from here, 8 blocks, 10 blocks away from here, and this industry down here. That we changed and made a sheltered workshop, and then research with a research council. And the guys who came in there, and I was on the board, the executive committee of it. And that's why one of the reasons I was hired, and we had a money collection for 1 year to get the money for it. And that's where some of the guys started to work writing their papers, studying sociology and physiology and so on. And one of the ones that started is Morten Söder, who is now the famous professor. And the first professor in Scandinavia in sociology for the disabled, disability sociology. He's unfortunately in Norway now, but he's my best friend.
Connect for me your academic interest in modern poetry, in American realism, literary criticism, philosophy, with the social service work you've done. How has one helped the other?
Yeah, it really hangs together. Partly because I was studying law, but little by little I felt I really wanted to study. I got interested in philosophy and mainly in modern literature. I was searching my way to find a way to look at life. And I found I had to make myself independent and make my own choice. And I let my parents accepted that. That was a little difficult, but I started to write and had it published and so on. So I did this. But meanwhile, when I got the point of view from some leading Swedish literature, the things that I read, cultural anthropology, when I read Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, and she, by the way, she grew up near Ferryboat in Minnesota, where her mother was a teacher, not a ferryboat, but in the school in Onabonda or whatever it was.
Owatonna.
Well, yeah, and then I read Erich Fromm, The Escape from Freedom. I read some Swedish modern philosophy, and with so-called concept analysis, according to modern philosophy. And I read ethics and aesthetics and so on, practical philosophy, and culture and literature. But thanks to literature, you get to interpret poets and interpret them, the poem as such, and the poets from their insights. You read novels and you learn about aspects of life, about a lot of persons and personalities, and you learn about the view of the writer. So you get to know of life from people who have structured it, who have dealt with it and tried to express it. They are tremendous teachers about various conditions of life. And I grew up, I read Strindberg as a kid, almost. I read Victor Hugo and the Les Miserables, for example, all his other novels, Notre Dame and The Laughing Man and The Workers of the Sea, when I was 10, 11, 12. And I liked them. I read Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist and so on. And I started to read Shakespeare later. And because that's the way to learn about life. And I went through that period after school also. I read drama in school. But after school and after military service, I started to read poetry. I didn't read poetry in school. And it struck me. And then I started to work very intensely with a couple of modern, because the first poetry that made sense to me was modern poetry that other people said is so difficult, it's so peculiar, so you can't understand it. But it made perfect sense to me. And they were then regarded as very difficult ones and so on. But that's I started, and they became my friends.
Who were these poets?
Gunnar Ekelöf and Erik Lindegren. I was going to write, and I'm going to publish now, what I have written and done together with him. We went through his first 2 books of poetry together. And I have notes about that I have saved, and that should have been beginning of my dissertation that I could never do. And the other became my best friend through life. He became a kind of older brother.
Lindegren?
Yes, and both became members of the Swedish Academy. And Ekelöf should have received the Nobel Prize if he hadn't died too early. Both of them died in 1968, in the spring and the week before I left for United States to write the Principles. And therefore, the thing I write about the American institutions, I have quotes from one of the long poem that Erik Lindegren wrote during the war, about the horrors of war. And I put that into the context of the horrors of institutions. And I opened it with saying, with a quote from, "To believe yourself born, though you are only born." The philosophy learned me to analyze things, concepts and things. And then when I learned literary criticism, I learned about the different genres, all the different ways of science dealing with literature. You have history of literature, you have history of styles, you have the biographies of persons, you have the psychiatry of writers, you have structure analysis of the poems or of prose, you have genre studies and so on. You have a lot of linguistic studies, you have so very many approaches to literature. And you have it from so many cultures and so many countries and so many ages. But also you had to make clear what are the concepts you are using, what are the instruments that you are using. And later with anthropology and so when I saw life, when I came I lived in France, came to Austria and worked in the refugee camps. I had a kind of maturity and background in knowing about people, about observing people, understanding, that I could feel empathy, and I could get out much more understanding of their situation and their interpretations of life than if I hadn't read literature. And the same I had when I met people with cerebral palsy. And I had a group that I worked that Hemingway with, and studied Hemingway. And he was as made for people with cerebral palsy, because you had to be honest. You had to be able to see yourself in the mirror. You had to be honest to yourself. You had to be true to yourself, as he said, and you had to be exact about it. And things about it. And he, of course, learned me a lot about life and how to write and how to express yourself as directly as possible. That's thanks to some Swedish writers, but also to Hemingway and Faulkner, with his enormous richness of the Yoknapatawpha County and all the personalities from severely retarded up to very fancy persons and very dramatic circumstances, a whole world, a whole century of experiences in various families, tremendously.
How did you connect Pound and Elliot to your world of developmental disability?
Because they taught me that I had to deep down to learn to understand them. I had to work with the dictionaries, and I had to work on it. Was Swedish writing was easy because I had the language. I'd grown up with it, and it's easier to analyze it quickly. But when you read, especially in the beginning, before I'd been to the United States and so on, and had only my school English and school French, that you have to work with. I had to work with dictionaries, and I worked line by line. But then I went to Yale and took seminars in there and got more used to the language and more used to the analysis and so on. And that kind of helped me to get to their point of view, because I had to learn to empathize. I had to learn to live into what they had written, What was their point of view? In Jay's point of view? And that kind of thing. And that kind of curiosity, that kind of learning about life, that curiosity, I think that has helped me dealing with Hungarian, meeting novels in reality, meeting situational poetry in reality with other people. That, of course I had. It helped my sensitivity. It helped my understanding. And it also helped my way of being able to communicate with people and sit down and talk in simple language about it. That's why I found it so important to invent what we call easy readers. I proud myself of the normalization principle that I've done, that I've been a pioneer in adult education for mentally handicapped. Partly because I said they grow adults, as I mentioned before, but also that they had to be helped by growing adults. And by the folk high school system, it goes through folk high schools and got that through by easy readers, where they read about adult life, not children's books, but as adults, so they can learn about adult life. One of the first books we had made was Summer with Monica, a film about modern young people, and who was not allowed to be shown in the United States because there were some nude love scenes there, and that was not allowed at that time. But that one. And now there are over 300 books, including classics, including special written books and so on. So there are, and we have forecast schools, over 20 forecast schools in Sweden have been opened. So we have over 4,000 Swedes. For some years ago, there were over 4,000 that had gone to forecast schools.